But let me welcome to the stage Jared Bernstein, who is the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors and is also my favorite labor economist ever. Jared, good to see you. Thank you so much. Oh. Okay, this is, I don't know, is this pay for play? Yeah. I don't know. How are you, Jared? Good to see you. Have a seat. Thank you so much for joining us. We had Cecilia Rouse here earlier. We're going to have Pierre Yared in a little bit. You know, everybody, I mean, I like the job you have. You know, I'm not smart enough to have had it, but, you know, we're sitting here talking about American growth, the U.S. economy, you know, and it's in a global context. But, I mean, you and I have been talking, I think, for decades, and I want to out you on a few things. I think Jared and the current National Economic Advisor to the President, Kevin Hassett, once wrote a fascinating paper on opportunity zones in the country, looking at how to, you know, frame and do opportunity zones. I was, you know, very privileged to be the first interviewer of Jared and Kevin on stage together. Kevin had co-written this book called Dow 36,000, and everybody said he was a nut job. You know, about, you know, thinking the Dow would ever hit 36,000. Like, it turns out he underestimated. I also, they had Senator Tim Scott and Senator Cory Booker as the first two sponsors of this deal, which you had tried to spare. So you were very bipartisan. You know, you were a thought-driven, pragmatic policy person on moving the economy forward, and that's what our goal is today: to look at what our blind spots are, what the opportunities are, and what the danger points are. Okay. So as you sort of look at it, you know, I'm not asking you to carry the burdens of all the other stuff you've done, but what do you think the opportunities are right now?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with you and with everyone. And I was thinking as I was standing there looking at you that you're aging a lot better than I am somehow. So maybe it's that diet.
If you trim your eyebrows, you'll look younger.
Oh, damn it. I wish I'd known that earlier. Well, I think the opportunities are very much on the side of productivity growth, and I obviously...
Is that AI?
Well, I mean, I was trying not to say AI in the first 30 seconds I got out here, but obviously that's an area where there's a lot of optimism about additions to productivity growth, and the quantifications of those numbers are really striking, and including by people who are really usually pretty sober. So
is it a way of saying productivity growth is promising there is that people are screwed?
Well, so that's definitely the other side of the equation. And I would say, I don't know how many people in this room are excited about AI, but I'm going to postulate the following: that if you pick a person out of an urn in Washington, D.C., and you ask them how they feel about the prospects of the future for vis-a-vis AI, and you do the same thing for someone out there and outside, you know, far enough outside the Beltway, you're going to get a pretty different view. And I think that there's your question is well taken. There's excitement and there's concern and dread. And of course, the dread is that instead of being complementary to you as someone in the workforce, it's substitutable. In other words, you can be displaced by it. At this point, we don't have a lot of evidence one way or another, but there's a great deal of nervousness, of course, especially about people who are did the right thing, played by the rules, you know, did a lot of what you just described on your earlier panel, and are nervous now about job prospects. In fact, we do see quickly rising unemployment rate for new college grads, and you know that is an area of real concern.
I want to ask you a question, taking off your political hat for a minute. It's very, very interesting because we've been at this for so many years, where there used to be an ideological tension between a kind of neoliberal take on trade policy, investment policy, no capital controls in the world, et cetera, and a court of, a more micro-oriented. I had a discussion recently, a side discussion, I don't think it was off the record, with Secretary Bessent, and he said, you know, he was just joking, he said, I spend most of my time explaining the macro to the micro. And I don't really know what that means, but I laughed.
Sounds good.
But I sort of think, you know, between those that have a more economy-oriented take versus those that were micro. And I always saw you when I knew you when I worked for Senator Bingaman in the 90s as someone who had a very good dexterity and literacy with the micro. And you worried that these macro trends could really, you know, harm micro realities in a way. And you worked with a lot of people, you know, Larry Summers and other people who had a very different orientation. Were you surprised that a lot of people that came into the Trump administration actually shared a lot of your early views about concern on the worker level?
Yeah, I mean, I remember Kevin himself, who Kevin Hassett, potentially the next Fed chair, saying to me, boy, I wish we had listened, and I don't want to say to me, but to the Economic Policy Institute, which is where I started.
Right.
That was one of the first groups that was...
Yeah, they're your biggest fans now.
Yeah, well, they were one of the first
Take
groups
them off the shelf.
that recognized the downsides of globalization, just like we were talking about the downsides of AI. And it's instructive, because if we don't prepare for the downsides of AI, we could be hit with the same disruptions we have suffered for decades by not preparing for the downsides of globalization. And for the record, I'm a huge booster of international trade, but I think this macro-micro...
You're a booster of international trade, but you were a guy who always liked tariffs, too.
Well, targeted, not sweeping. So targeted, yeah. All day long, if somebody is trading unfairly and they're dumping rubber tire grade 4 on your economy, go ahead and tariff the heck out of them. This sweeping approach, I think, is more destructive. But the point is that if, one of the words I dislike most in economics is transition. And that's kind of a curse word, really, which is when you hear an economist say, well, there'll be a transition. We'll have an intense period of globalization, an intense period of technological change, and how's it going to affect working people? Well, they'll transition to a better place. That just is another way of saying a bunch of people are going to get screwed, but they don't really have the political power for us to care much about it. So what I've always tried to do is to maximize the benefits from the kinds of large technological and global forces while being mindful and trying to help people get on the right side as opposed to on the wrong side. And that's the macro-micro, where, to me, that's where you want to be.
And there was also a tension. I mean, I just want to sort of get it because I do want to get into some of your views of where we're going with some of the economic policies now. But, during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, you had essentially corruption in the marketplace. You had, the sky falling. And you had this interesting juxtaposition of a lot of people that were all of a sudden underwater in their mortgages all around the country for an event that was not their doing at all. That was not part, they were not complicit in any of the evil doing and, policy making or loan decisions. But then you had other people that were part of the destructive direction, and
they got bailed out.
They got bailed out. Not only did they get bailed out, they got bailed out by taxpayers. Yeah. But at these firms, there were at least more than 5,000 people in these firms that got $1 million or more bonuses in that year. I remember that moment, and I've just said, "Wow, this is going to haunt the political system." Yeah. And it was the Democrats that were responsible for that situation. Do you think that was navigated correctly? And do you think those tensions between sort of a Wall Street oriented elite are still in place? And do you need to have a kind of different? I mean, I think to give them credit, I think to some degree what's driving a lot of what the Trump administration is doing, not everything, because I think they have their own meme coins and all that, and that's a whole nother conference. But I think at the same time, when you look at the tension between those in the street with their homes, workers and others, I'm just wondering if those tensions still exist.
I think those tensions exist, and I think they're probably more amplified than we realize. We obviously have a large private credit system. Back then it was shadow banking, now it's private credit. We don't have the kinds of eyeballs into some of the risks there that we'd like. I think that what happened, and you're right, we could have a conference about this, but the bursting of the housing bubble and the subsequent implosion followed by bailouts to get the credit system back up and running, and I was in the Obama administration back then and was, my fingerprints are on those rescue policies. I think that's actually...
I always thought you were the minority view, though.
This is a good example of where I try to wear these different hats in different worlds. I recognize that if you don't have a flowing credit system, it's like, a physical body that doesn't have blood pressure. And so you had to get that system back up and running. And what that meant was you had to actually help a lot of people who had brought the system down. And the problem in economic terms, talk micro, is moral hazard. And the time you worry about moral hazard is not in the middle of the crisis. You don't have that luxury. It's before the crisis starts. And that actually gets to your question. So one of my favorite economists in the context of what you're asking about is the late, great Hyman Minsky. And Minsky, who was a banker, but also an economist, invented this idea of the Minsky cycle. And the idea would be that as the expansion proceeds, the bubbles and the reckless finance that brought down the last expansion fades in the rearview mirror of our memory, and we start deregulating, we start underpricing risk, and we start embedding systemic underpriced risk into the economy. I kind of see that happening now, and every day I pick up the paper. It's not on the front page. It's on page B3 of the Wall Street Journal. Here's another capital requirement that's been taken down. Here's here's another asset that is not being, in my view, properly monitored in terms of its risk. And of course, I've written had an op-ed in the Times a few weeks ago suggesting that AI investment looks awful bubbly. So I worry that the Minsky cycle is in play again, and that we are once again looking at underpriced risk.
So I hear that. I also know that you think a lot about labor and workers and whatnot, how to basically think about the backbone of the economy on that front.
Yep.
Take where we are today. What would be, a package of 2 or 3 or 4 of the most important helping labor-oriented policies that you think would be smart to put in place?
Well, my work in job markets, labor, a lot of the things you associate me with, has a lot to do. And I worked for Joe Biden for many years. One thing that he will always underscore is bargaining power, bargaining clout. So anything that helps workers have more bargaining power is going to raise the likelihood that they'll get what I would call their fair share of the growth they're helping to create. Decades ago, Larry Michel and I made a graph showing how productivity was rising, but median compensation, which used to go up with productivity, was flatlining while productivity was rising, and that's just another way of talking about inequality. If you improve worker bargaining clout, those gaps tend to close. So one of the policy changes we need to make in this space is to allow more sectoral bargaining. Other countries, all of which have higher union densities than we do, have more sectoral bargaining, and so that's something that you really can't do in this country. So that's something I would put in place. The next thing I would do, though, would be to really lean into affordability. Obviously, this is a word you've heard a lot about these days, and I think rightfully so. I think the president is interesting on this.
Did you come up with that on your own, or
yes, I did.
Was it focus group tested?
Word. No. Yeah. I think that the American people came up with that word. Yeah. And remember, I was there in 21, 22, going out to the cameras in the White House talking about, hey, we just got an inflation report that was 4% instead of 9%. Isn't that great? And everyone was saying, no, that's not great, because people were upset about the level of prices, and they still are.
They would shove you out in front of the camera.
Well, yes, this was that has been my fate. I remember back in the Obama years, we had, right when we got started, we had a month where job losses, the negative, was negative 800,000. That happened. That would have been, one of the first months of the Obama administration. I had to go out to the cameras, and David Axelrod, I was just sitting there very hangdog, like, what the hell can I say? And Axelrod patted me on the back, and he said, get out there, Bernstein. Anybody can sell good news. I don't know why. I should have said, why don't you go out there? I think if you want, so yes, I think on the wage side, low unemployment, strong union bargaining, that's all helpful. But I think people are struggling with housing, with healthcare, with utilities, groceries, and all of those. Groceries is a hard one, but all of those other, childcare, are very much amenable to policy reforms. And I've been working with a lot of folks to articulate those.
What do you, when you kind of think at that level and you think, the world of AI coming and tech coming, is it going to be the same old story, or is this a different moment in terms of the scale? I mean, I've got Steve Case coming up shortly, and, I do think 1998, 99, I knew you when I was in New America. We got $1 million from the Marco Foundation to go talk to Americans about how their lives were going to change from broadband. And I sort of wonder, are we now at another point where everything is going to change and we need to conceptualize just how the social contract's going to change and how our identity's going to change? Bill Foster was up here, and he's very pessimistic about what it will do to people's sense of self-worth.
Yeah, AI is the thing we say most about and know least about. That ratio is asymptotically growing. And so I think the right answer to that question is unknowable, but I'm not going to cop out, because the right thing to do when you have an unknowable question with a particularly fat tail risk at the end of it, which this is to hope for the best and plan for the worst. And what does that mean in this context? So let me hit you with an idea that maybe sounds a little radical. I hope not. It's something we've tried in this country before. But we need a national job guarantee program. We need a program that basically says to people, if it turns out that our worst fears are true and AI is massively displacing, and I can give you 5 people who say yes and 5 people who say no, then we need to have a way for you to quickly get back into the workforce and to do something productive and with dignity and with.
So this is a WPA-like thing?
Yeah, this is in the spirit of something like that. I mean, you and I are old enough to remember CETA, which was actually a lot more successful. That was a guaranteed job program in the 1980s. It was actually a lot more successful than people thought it was. And look, I'm not saying that this is the perfect solution. You'd much rather have markets generating adequate employment, and maybe we'll be okay with that. But just in case, we need to prepare for that. So that's something I'm working on with some colleagues.
What do you have the most fear about when it comes to the current trade policy of the administration?
That they're going to break the golden goose of international trade. That their understanding of the benefits of international trade is just really foundationally inadequate, and they're so over-focused on the costs that they're going to squander the benefits. And look, we're in a world where I just talked about affordability. The main lasting, ongoing solution to affordability shortfalls is greater supply. And one of the reasons we trade with other countries is to push out our global supply curve. Let me tell you about this from I think you'll relate. We came up in the same arguments here. When I came up arguing about international trade, everybody I fought with, and I was the skunk at every garden party, argued that the more international trade, the better. There are no downsides. Because why? Because everybody's a consumer. And anything that helps the consumer is something we should do all day long. My argument was no. Everybody's a consumer, but they're also a worker, at least if you're not retired. And so a trade policy that says everyone's a consumer and therefore we don't have to worry about workers is totally wrong-headed and will lead you to shocks, globalization shocks that will decimate important communities and to a politics which we are enjoying today. But conversely, a trade policy that argues everybody is a worker and nobody's a consumer is equally wrong-headed, and that's where they're coming from.
So I just, so I always try to basically walk in different shoes, different perspectives, and so when I think about it, we have Jameson Greer here. I think if you have Jameson up here, he's not against trade, international trade, but he's a believer in tariffs and rebalancing. And when I go back to the old EPI, Economic Policy Institute papers, I think I see a lot of the DNA of that view in the work that you folks did. If you were to step back, other than maybe Peter Navarro, whom I invited to speak today but couldn't make it, I mean, I see people basically, hey, we're not walking away from international trade, we're reframing international trade. So is the opposition to the Trump administration's trade agenda hyperventilating about some falsehoods?
So that's a really good caveat. And in fact, one of the things that I've been struck by is if you look at the trade data, you don't see all that much.
Right.
So you have a point. In terms of imports and exports and the trade balance, it all looks sort of the same. And so I don't want to hyperventilate, but I still think I'm fundamentally right in the following sense.
The data don't show it, but he's right.
Yeah, no, it's the data don't show it yet. So what I'm worried about is less the current state of trade flows. And by the way, when I say they haven't changed, but I'm talking aggregates. If you look at our imports from China, they're way down. But if you look at our imports from other places, many of whom China is already trading with, so we're getting transshipments from them through those countries, they're back up. So, the trade balance is kind of the same. No, here's what I'm worried about. And again, your caveat is well taken. I am worried that we are screwing up international relations in a way that's going to hurt us in terms of a level of international cooperation that I believe is positive for growth and for our future. So it's less about trade flows at this point and more about international relations. Now, look, if you're talking to Jameson Greer, they really have said that they want the trade deficit to go to zero. I mean, I'm not making that up. They've said that. Now, maybe they don't mean it, but they've said that. And that, they haven't accomplished that, which is good. But in part, your argument is saying, well, hey, Jared, they haven't been able to do what they said they're going to do, so isn't it okay? And, that's worrisome to me.
What's the last thing you want to leave this audience with that's very interested in the future of American growth on one thing we need to get right?
I don't see how we can have the kind of future that probably everybody in here wants to have with the dysfunctional politics with which we're suffering. We didn't even talk about the unsustainable fiscal path we're on, and that's okay.
I had other people do that.
Yeah, okay, well, and I've been a fiscal dove forever. So
no, I know. I had Maya McGinnis up here. You guys have been arguing forever, but now you're on the same page.
Now that I'm a little hawkish, that should tell you something. But and this is not a R versus D thing. This is very much a bipartisan thing. Is that I don't see. I suspect that probably we will all share this sentiment that we need a much more functional politics if we're going to have the economic outcomes that we would probably all agree we want.
Well, I just want to thank you for a lifetime of service. You've been able to wrestle with lots of different things. I've always seen you engage with anyone with ideas, no matter what side of the aisle they're on. And again, I really valued that time. We were, working with Kevin Hassett and all this. But ladies and gentlemen, Jared Bernstein, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Jared, thank you, man.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you.